In 1942, the former Hitler Youth member, Hans Scholl, took a stand against the Nazis by creating a resistance group called the White Rose. After realizing that his faith in Hitler was misplaced, he, along with a few close friends, began printing leaflets and distributing them at Munich University, ultimately inspiring other German citizens to question both Hitler and the ideals of the entire Nazi Party. While attending the University of Munich, Scholl met Alex Schmorell and Willy Grof, who redirected his life from a study of medicine to a study of religion and philosophy. With these like-minded individuals, who also despised the Nazis, by his side, Scholl was able to put together a group that would meet and discuss what they could do to take a stand against the Nazis, and, as a result, the White Rose was born. The year was 1918. World War I was finally coming to a close. Germany was left in shambles. Not a corner of the country was left without destruction. The German people had lost hope and were looking for someone, anyone, who could pull them out of the nightmare and restore the pride of their great country. In 1919, Adolf Hitler began his rise to power by sharing his ideologies and political views. Many of those who had lost hope put their faith in Hitler to heal their country and restore them to greatness. He started youth programs and most children in Germany joined. These groups prepared young men for military while also preparing the young women for motherhood. Most were proud to say that they were a part of Hitler Youth. He was bringing hope into the country and into the lives of many. One of the many families who sought hope in Hitler was the Scholl family. Hans, Inge, and Sophie all excitedly joined the Hitler Youth. When Hitler came to power, the whole family immediately accepted him, as they were under the impression that Hitler's ideals and leadership skills would pull their country out of the brink of disaster. Hans Scholl was extremely dedicated to the Hitler Youth organization, so much so that he became the leader of his own troop. However, he felt that the Hitler Youth repressed individual thought and expression. In an attempt to bring these qualities into the Hitler Youth program, Hans brought elements of religion, philosophy, and international culture to his troop. In 1937, Hans Scholl and his troop created their own flag of self-expression. After appearing at a rally with their new flag that did not contain Nazi emblems and for breaking other Nazi regulations, Hans was arrested and incarcerated for 3 months. Hans and his father, Robert Scholl, were the first of their family to realize that Hitler and the Nazis were not leading Germany to greatness, but instead into a war that was already lost. This realization led Hans to take a stand against the Nazis by creating the White Rose. The White Rose was mainly composed of university students and one professor. Together, they spoke out against Adolf Hitler and his regime. The founder, Hans Scholl, took up the long process of dismissing himself from the Hitler Youth as he grew disenchanted with Nazi ideology once its real aims became evident. At first, the intent of the group was not to take a stand against Hitler and the Nazis. In fact, they weren't even considered a resistance group until 1942, after Hans began discussing his opinions of the Nazis. In their first meetings, they merely discussed literature and their opinion on what was happening in the war. Over time, however, their weekly discussions morphed into a hatred for Hitler. Eventually, one of the members decided it was time that the rest of Germany knew the truth, starting with the people at Munich University.
More kind of a moral indignation, I would say. It came out as more and more indignation and screaming. This can't go on, where we're going. We are so far away from what's right and what should be right and what's moral in the deepest sense.
When Sophie discovered her brother's covert operation, she begged to participate in the activities of the White Rose, despite the risks involved. During the summer of 1942, Scholl and a friend composed 4 leaflets that exposed and denounced the Nazis, including the extermination of Jews and others that Hitler deemed unworthy of life, and called for a resistance to the regime. The literature was peppered with quotations from great writers and thinkers, such as Aristotle, and said that it was time for the rebirth of Germany. The first leaflet stated, "Nothing is more shameful to a civilized nation than to allow itself to be governed by an irresponsible clique of sovereigns who have given themselves over to dark urges, and that without resisting. Isn't it true that every honest German is ashamed of his government these days? Who among us can imagine the degree of shame that will come upon us and upon our children when the veil falls from our faces and the awful crimes that infinitely exceed any human measure are exposed to the light of day? If the German nation is so corrupt and decadent in its innermost being that it is willing to surrender the greatest possession a man can own, a possession that elevates mankind above all other creatures, namely free will, if it is willing to surrender this without so much as raising a hand, then yes, They deserve their destruction.
Long term, they were effective because once people start talking about their words, they have changed Germany. They've really made a difference in the long-term picture.
The risks involved in creating and more so distributing these leaflets were great. Many knew the consequences they would be subjected to if caught, yet they insisted on continuing anyways. The lives of average civilians were monitored for any deviation from absolute loyalty to the German leader. Even a casual remark critical of Hitler or the Nazis could result in arrest by the Gestapo. Yet the members of the White Rose, risking everything along the way, furthered their stance against the Nazis by continuing the creation and distribution of the leaflets. They had nothing going for them except for their idealism, the highest moral and ethical principles, and sympathy for their Jewish neighbors and friends. Their words largely impacted the average German citizen. Diaries bound from the time of the war often mention the White Rose as inspirational or the hope of Germany.
In essence, the White Rose was revolutionary.
It was a miracle that the group lasted as long as they did, considering the secret police were always watching the citizens of Germany in search of anyone who might be in a resistance. They increased their chances of not getting caught by having some of the members of their group turn in a few of the leaflets to the Gestapo in order to make them seem less suspicious. They would leave their leaflets in phone booths, on benches, in boxes at the university, and occasionally take them to other cities as well. Some were even mailed to university professors and students. They would also send some to each other just to make sure the letters were going through with no problem. However, it seemed like the world was against them. During this time, paper and envelopes were extremely scarce, and buying them in large quantities easily made one a suspect. The members of the White Rose had to be extremely cautious. In addition to creating and printing leaflets, the White Rose also engaged in graffiti. The visuals they painted on walls and other public places protested the Nazis in simple yet powerful ways. The group continued with their meetings and activities for a year until they were eventually reported to the Gestapo. On February 18, 1943, Sophie and Hans personally distributed the 6th leaflet at the university. It stated, "The day of reckoning has come, the reckoning of our German youth with the most abominable tyranny our people have ever endured. In the name of the entire German people, we demand of Adolf Hitler's state the return of personal freedom, the most precious treasure of the Germans, which he cunningly has cheated us out of." They hurriedly dropped stacks of copies in empty corridors for students to find as they came from lecture halls. Leaving before the class break, the Scholls noticed that some copies remained in the suitcase and decided it would be a shame and a waste not to distribute them. They climbed the staircase and threw the remaining leaflets over the balcony. Luck was not on their side as their action was observed by the janitor and they were reported to the police and arrested.
The reason they acted as harshly as they did is they were afraid that if they didn't nip it in the bud, that other people would also rise up and listen to their words.
Sophie and Hans were questioned for 4 days in Munich, and their trial was set for February 22nd. They, along with Christoph Probst, were sentenced to death. Their execution would be held the next day.
Stand as a kind of a symbol of a remarkable, selfless act of conscience in a horribly brutal atmosphere.
Due to the fact that they faced their deaths bravely, the Nazi guards allowed the Scholls one last meeting with their parents. Hans and Sophie both went individually to meet with their parents for the last time. Hans was the first to meet with them. His mother cried and repeated the words, "I love you," over and over as his father stated how proud he was. His mother offered him some candy, which he politely refused, before telling his parents he would see them again. Next up was Sophie. Her mother offered the candy to Sophie, who accepted, saying, "Sure, might as well." Neither Hans nor Sophie shed a single tear in front of their parents. They wanted their parents' last memories of them to be not tearful, but with them happy, as they always were. Once she reached her cell, Sophie broke into tears. When the guard asked why she was crying, Sophie responded only by asking if he ever had to say goodbye to his mother for what he knew was the last time. The 3 friends were allowed one last meet together before their death. They were sentenced to be beheaded, a punishment reserved for political traitors. They marched to the place of their death with pride, heads held high, all the while Sophie saying she was proud of what they did and would do it all over again. The White Rose did many things to take a stand against the Nazis. They were willing to sacrifice their own lives in order to show the people of Germany what Hitler's real motives were. However, Hans Scholl's last words were what left the biggest impact on the German people. Just before the guillotine came down, Hans Scholl cried out, "Long live freedom."